Hello, and welcome to the Voices of the Australian Alumni, a brand new podcast series presented by the Australian Consulate General in Mumbai. I am your host, Tejas Nair, a proud Australian alumnus, culture entrepreneur, and a new media artist. With this series, we hope to shine a light on successful Australian alumni, learn about how they have adopted to the new normal, and discuss the future for the sectors in which they operate. Today we're speaking with Pallavi Sharda, Australian Indian performing artist, writer, and advocate who studied law, French, and media at the University of Melbourne. Pallavi has starred in several Bollywood productions along with big-ticket Hollywood productions such as the forthcoming Tom and Jerry film, feature television series, and more. She is also on the board of advisors for eKutir, a social entrepreneurship company focused on promoting sanitization, mother and child nutrition, and working towards uplifting the conditions of rural farmers through sustainable means.
Hi, Pallavi. How's it going?
Hi, Tejas. It's going very well. Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you. And I know a lot of people from the alumni network and outside are going to be very interested in hearing about your story and your journey and things you've been up to. How's the last year or so been? I know it's been strange for everybody. What's your experience been like?
What's my COVID story?
Yeah.
It's been really intense, actually. I was, based in India for a number of years, working there. I actually started my career as an actor in India. And this year I had to remotely say goodbye to my Bombay home without actually seeing it, feeling it, being in the space. I was caught in transit in March of this year, just after finishing a shoot in England, and was transiting through Colombo with the hope of going to Bombay around mid-March. And then coming back to Australia to visit my parents. But then I just got on a connecting flight to Melbourne and haven't been back to the airport since, which is very strange for me. And then in August, after having been here for a few months, we went into our second wave lockdown because Melbourne had a spike, which was starting to get quite scary. I was shooting a show in lockdown for the ABC in Australia and obviously couldn't leave myself, and everything kind of pointed towards the fact that I had to choose Australia as my home base for a little while until the world settles down. And so I, over the phone, packed up my house and shipped it to Melbourne. So my belongings of the last decade basically are sitting in my father's garage in Melbourne. And I just sort of reconnected with the city that I left at the age of 20. It's been pretty intense to have to make those life decisions, in a way that's not in your control. And I'm someone that's on the road constantly.
Yeah, for sure. Wow. Sounds like you had a really busy schedule leading right up to the lockdown, which I think most of us are now feeling, right? Like it's been all these months of just complete standstill for anyone that had a schedule packed with traveling and moving around. It's been really bizarre. But I want to know, was this always the case? Like growing up, were you always kind of moving around country to country with the family, or were you sort of in one place at one time? How was it?
Yeah, I traveled a lot, actually. I think, when you have parents that are migrants, obviously there's that sense of the homeland that you go back to. So my first trip overseas was to the US when I was 2. My first trip to India was when I was 5. And India really got into my veins from a young age. So I was not one of those kids that was like, Mujhe India nahi jana, I don't want to go to India. It's this, it's that. I was like, take me to India. When I was a kid, I was fascinated by this country that I was ostensibly from, but rarely saw. It was this history when you're living very basic suburban life in Australia, the myth of the homeland is so kind of larger than life and kind of carries all of these stories in your head forward. So I ended up actually from a young age traveling alone as well. I went to Chennai to live when I was 9 to learn Bharatanatyam, and came back a 10-year-old going on 16 because I had experienced all kinds of displacement and identity crises. Also being North Indian, going to school in Chennai when you're 9, like you don't even understand living in Australia, the local kind of politics of identity politics of that. And obviously my parents were like, she'll be fine. I came back totally traumatized. But then, we've always been a traveling family. My mother used to she was the director of South Asia Relations at the University of Western Australia for a number of years. Her expertise was actually in international education between India and Australia. So she would go to India 3-4 times a year, and I would either join her or, hear her stories. And learning French, I went to live in France when I was 17. So the bug was in me. There was no scope of me actually getting a job in the law and working in an office 9 to 5. Hence packing my bags and leaving right when I was about to graduate.
Wow. Yeah, and in essence, I guess what you've just also told us is that you're like the perfect example of a diaspora kid, like a third culture kid that has sort of seen all these unique cultures, as well as, at an age where, that's when you're kind of absorbing the most, I guess, when you're not even a teenager yet. You're just trying to like absorb everything you get, and that excitement is definitely unique. And how did that reflect upon your education, in essence? Like, you were studying Bharatanatyam in Chennai, but I'm assuming you also did your schooling in high school in Australia, or?
Yes, 100%. I've done primary school in one school, high school, one school, uni. I had a pretty stable academic life, which I think was the one thing that actually, if I look back, gave stability to everything, was that I wasn't moving around schools or anything, which can add a different layer. My elder brother, for example, changed schools a lot. And I think that is also like a sort of sense of displacement that you feel as a child. But I was sort of, it was more the kind of the in and out of going in between Indian culture and Australian culture. That was my constant transition and oscillation. But yeah, it was an interesting thing, as you say. I was absorbing all of these cultural reference points, and being of the first generation of Indian Australian kids to really have been brought up here with a cohort and a community around me. It was a very unique experience because our parents, my friends, family friends' parents, all arrived in the 80s as part of the skilled migrant scheme from India. My father was a PhD from IIT. My mum had studied at IIT Delhi as well. So they were really welcomed into Australia because of their expertise. So it was a very different migrant experience to what a lot of people have coming to a country like Australia, which only 10 years before had a pretty dicey policy when it came to non-white Australian migrants, or non-white migrants, I should say. And so you didn't realize it at the time, but that really shaped our kind of cultural space and how we perceived ourselves as well. There was a sense of being other by virtue of, being very distinct in our community and what that meant, and also distinct from other migrant communities, because I guess, for lack of a better word, there was a level of privilege attached to our experience, which a lot of migrants don't necessarily have, because either they've come as, asylum seekers after the Vietnam War. If you think of the Vietnamese diaspora, they've come in, the Second World War era. If you think of the Greek and the European diaspora, and obviously they're broad strokes. It's a lot more nuanced than that. But it made for a very secure upbringing, but also, I guess, allowed us that privilege of ambition and aspiration, and what do we want to be when we grow up? How do we design our lives? Like, we were privy to those very Western concepts, those very kind of young Australian concepts of how do you want to live? It's a free world. You can choose your destiny. And in my case, maybe that was my undoing. Because I'd seen a few Bollywood films, so I was like, that's what I want to do.
Yeah, that it's interesting you say that. So obviously the community that you grew up within clearly means a lot to you, the way you speak about it. And I just want to know, did that experience entail that you also were exposed continuously to Indian culture, even though you grew up in Australia? Was that like a part of everyday life?
Very much so. Very much so. I say, when I enter this house that I'm staying in right now, where I grew up, I basically enter a home that could be in Delhi, because my parents speak Hindi. They're both professors. They're both very, very educated, proficient in English. My Nanaji did his PhD in London. So I come from an academic privileged family where it's not a language, there's no linguistic barrier to living in Australia. So the choice to speak Hindi wasn't because my parents, that was their first language or anything like that. It was purely for the sake of cultural preservation and promotion. So that really, at the point that you're using that as a choice, I think that really indicates the kind of values that you're inculcating as you grow up. And it's really about understanding and heralding Indian culture as something which is positive, and the spiritual elements of it, the artistic elements of it, the cultural elements of it, linguistic elements, were all things that were designed to enrich our lives beyond what we already had. And we lapped it up. I think we were very lucky, perhaps because our parents, my brother and I, had parents who were teachers and grandparents who were teachers. There was very much that old school Indian kind of wisdom that was imparted, in a sense. And it really felt like there was access to a world that was unique, and we understood that there was something special about it. So we really embraced it, and we spoke Hindi fluently as children. I mean, when I went to India for the first time, people couldn't believe I was Aussie because I could switch into Hindi and also switch into an Indian English accent perfectly. And they were like, have you really grown up in Australia? Have you just studied there for a few years and you're saying that? And I was like, great. They all think I'm the village idiot. Like, well done. I'm like saying namaste to people, and they're like, you say hi. Why are you saying namaste?
Fair enough. And was you training as a classical dancer also a byproduct of this? Did that start off in Australia, or was it more when you were in Chennai?
No, it definitely started in Australia. We have a really rich diasporic art scene here. And I was born in Perth, where there was the Temple of Arts, I believe it's called. And then Melbourne had a very strongly established Bharatanatyam school and culture, for the last sort of 20 years, even before my parents arrived. I think there were a few artists. Melbourne is a very artistically rich city. There was something so, I guess, larger than life and goddess-like. And again, it was this idea of access to this special magical world that I could tap into. And so my parents just did it. When we moved to Melbourne and I was 3, I attended my first Bharatanatyam class at the age of 3, and I never looked back.
Wow, that's a really early age. But yeah, as with most traditional art forms, I guess that's as early as one would get in. And it's really interesting that you first experienced Bharatanatyam at that early an age, and in a place like Australia, obviously, where it's not, it's not something one would expect out of the blue. So it really shows how strong the community was, I guess, in terms of preserving that culture along with them. And was this also sort of the time where you were first exposed to Bollywood and Indian cinema and stuff, or did that come a little bit later?
It probably came a little bit later. I remember watching the old VHS tapes that we would get in the 90s, right? So I watched Chand and Lamhe on repeat when I was a kid. And Sri Devi was a Bharatanatyam dancer and all of those things. So it all lined up for me. I was like, this is my destiny, just in celluloid form. And I think, and also in Lamhe, her name was Pallavi, and I was just like, this is a sign. Literally, when you're a child, you look for these things. I witness my friends' kids now that are 3 or 4, and they have such vibrant imaginations. And, the way you connect dots in your mind as a kid is so interesting. And, I think, just thinking back now with a sort of the child psychology mindset, I'm like, it makes total sense that a child would seek belonging in that or find parity there. So, and then when we moved to Melbourne, my parents had to start again in terms of developing their friendship groups and all of those things, because they'd been in Perth for 6 years. And a part of that community was very much, watching Bollywood films. And it was probably more Indian oriented than Perth. Perth was probably a little bit more multicultural because there was not a big community there. So perhaps if I grew up in Perth, I don't know if it would have been different. But in Melbourne, there definitely was a very wide-reaching diasporic community. And I think it was just a part of the glue of that cultural cohesion. The culture of Bollywood was filled with nostalgia. And also, it was the 90s, so you only got that one film that came out every few weeks or whatever. And so everybody shared in that collective experience. So there was that cohesion that was happening. And yeah, I was obsessed. And for my father, it was a means for me to learn the Hindi language.
I'm curious, what was it like? Obviously, you had this impression of the world of Bollywood and Indian pop culture and so on. But like you said, the diaspora circles are still a very small pocket within which there is room to express. But when you actually hit Bombay, what was that experience like? Was it what you expected, or were you taken by surprise?
It was so tough. Our listeners cannot see the look on my face right now, but you can. I mean, I was a girl from Melbourne with her bags who turned up to Bombay with no friends or family, like in that city. So it was starting from scratch. And you're from Bombay, you know this world.
That brings me to the fact that obviously in many ways you've had the firsts of so many experiences for, say, an Indian Australian trying to, balance uh, the culture, the professional success, the representation elements of both countries and both sides of the picture. How has that landscape changed, in your opinion? Like now, when you're back in Australia, what do you see within the community and the diaspora? Have things changed? Because obviously, what happens within these communities all around the world, Australia included, also reflects on the relationship between those two countries. And you share a very strong relationship with both India and Australia. So from your lens, what does that look like today?
It's a really interesting question. I think it's kind of like there's sort of two ways to answer it. One is how the diaspora has changed, like at a literal level, in terms of the cohort and the demographic of the diaspora has changed immensely. A lot of, there was a big push for international education to target India. A lot of international students like yourself came here. I was very much aware and a part of that indirectly because I had parents that worked in higher education. So I saw it change very dramatically in the 90s. They had a few students that were Indian and my mum would cook for them and bring them home, and then all of a sudden you're in Melbourne and you're like, where are all the white people? Which is wonderful. I say that positively, but I saw that demographic change. And what happens then is they're coming as young people who go to university here as opposed to young couples who are bringing up kids and cultural preservation was not the same because we're talking about pre-liberalization India when my parents came versus post-liberalization India. So Indias they grew up in were very different. But yeah, my reference points were like the old world of India based on my parents, what memories they carried. Whereas automatically it's a more globalized world that newer migrants have grown up in. So their experience with Australia is very different. It's a lot more amenable to assimilation in the way that, a lot of Western countries like to talk about assimilation. And being able to switch values, it's not as much of a culture shock, I would think, because you have access to the internet and so many things. But I do see that it's also very, geography specific. So you'll have a lot of people that come from one area, a lot of Punjabis, a lot of Haryanvis, a lot of people from Chennai, and then are able to form those community groups when they arrive here. Whereas when we were here, there was a lot of intermingling and there's a real pan-Indian diasporic consciousness from my generation. Yeah, like, you'd be celebrating Diwali with people from the Fiji Indian community or the Durban Indian community or Gujarati associations. I'm learning Bharatanatyam, which is a South Indian traditional dance form, like dancing to Tamil Carnatic music being taught by a Sri Lankan Tamil woman. So that was my experience, which I hold very. My godmother who brought me up in Perth was Bengali, so I spoke fluent Bangla as a kid. So it really helped me then as an actress in India. People were like, "Who is this girl? Why does she know all these languages and parts of India?" I think that that's probably not the case so much now in terms of exposure. I could be wrong because I have spent quite a bit of time away. But to answer the question from the other angle, in terms of how things have changed, I think what's interesting is if we talk about the host community, the Australian community, and talk about like this push for inclusive representation, which is so much a part of what I do as a job, because my work is in the culture industry. It's about how we see ourselves as a society. So I've just seen that there is a lot more, there's a lot more of a push towards ensuring that representation is taking place. And I'm seeing it change rapidly. Like even in the last 3 years since I have, like my last film in India was Begum Jan. was with Vidya Balan, and that was like a feminist film in which I played a sex worker. And I was like, okay, great. I've lit a fire on the Bollywood archetype. Now I can go and like start some other crazy chapter of this journey. And that was moving back to Australia to work. And you could just see, I've seen the change in the kind of storytelling of what sort of characters I might be able to play in the eyes of creators that don't have cultural experience of an Indian person. That's diversified. Now, when I did a show in which I was the lead for the ABC during lockdown, I came on as a script consultant because they realized they had cast an Indian woman as the lead. So obviously that changes her interaction with the script. And I'm trying to really push and pioneer that sensitivity at all levels of the culture making process so that it's not just a gaze of like us and them interacting. It's really like breaking down the fabric of those barriers. And I hope that both of these segments, like the established culture institutions and this new growing diaspora will have a lot more of a cross-cultural connection and intersection as the years go on.
Cool. And also you mentioned that, your work obviously looks at this exchange of culture quite closely now since you've moved back to Australia. And I know you're also the ambassador for Ozfest, which looks at the celebration of Indian and Australian culture together. And from that lens, do you see a lot more opportunity for maybe Indian as well as Australian kids that grew up in the diaspora? Because I know there's also a lot of Australian kids that are now grown up in India to some degree because their parents might have worked here or they probably traveled a lot in India and so on. So they have a better understanding of the country and its culture as well. Does Ozfest also prove to be this sort of playground to showcase year on year what the diaspora or the landscape of this cultural exchange looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I was heavily involved with Ozfest back in 2012-13 when I think it launched in a really big way. And, what was interesting then was the appreciation by, the Australian High Commission and DFAT and the government about the need to move beyond just a fiscal relationship and a trade relationship between the two countries. And I think that, and that came in the form of education as an export and many other things. And I think at the core of it, we are very similar countries. If you look at our colonial history, our Commonwealth history, Westminster system of government, they sound academic, but they're actually very true in terms of how much there is to play with as a point of similarity. The cricket rivalry is such a big part of that cultural exchange. I mean, I remember one of my team members, I did something in Melbourne a few years ago with Shane Warne. It was a festival called Moomba. We were both like the king and queen of Moomba. I've worked with like Shah Rukh Khan and Ranbir Kapoor, Ayushmann Khurrana, Mithun Da, like everyone, right? Vidya Balan. My team member did not care. I come back from like Melbourne after that trip and he was like, "Madam, you're with Shane Warne." He was just like in tears. Like, I was just like, I love how you cared nothing for all of these Bollywood stars, but Shane Warne was like the epitome that I had made it in his eyes. So it just showed to me like how key that cricket relationship is. And I was the host of the IPL for Sony ESPN a few years ago, and that was when I came out as an Australian and showed my Australian avatar to the world, but also really felt this kind of visceral link between the two countries. So I think all of these things have incredible scope to build a really strong relationship. And I think the IPL has done a great job in terms of, really endearing a lot of the Australian players to the country and how much love they get in India. And I think there are so many more avenues that we can explore to make this a really, really strong link.
For sure. And I remember we were speaking about this on our first call as well, about the difference between, say, the impact that the fringe and the mainstream can have. And you've been, in the position to work in two absolute, mammoth mainstream sectors, which is cricket and cinema, Bollywood. And, they both have this immense impact on both cultures or any culture that they integrate with. Do you think there is the opportunity to use those platforms as means to share more information and share these experiences, like you said?
I think definitely. I think, film particularly is one that is probably underused in terms of how we create that joint consciousness, particularly in terms of harnessing the talent that exists within the diaspora. I think diasporic filmmakers have had a lot of success in Canada, in the UK, in the US, and diasporic actors. I mean, just take Gurinder, take Mira Nair, take Mindy Kaling. So many of my friends and colleagues that are overseas. I think in Australia we're definitely lagging, and that was a part of my research in my media degree, was like, why are we lagging so far behind in terms of creation? And I think that has been because Australia is a smaller country and we're probably less resourced in terms of how we are funded in terms of screen projects, if I talk about the film industry. And I think, there has always been a sense of the migrant communities or the Indigenous communities being the minority. But actually, I would love to see a world in which all of our identities are interlinked as one majority. And I think if we can change our perception towards that, like, it would create a lot of robust storytelling. And I think it's through the sharing of stories fundamentally that these person-to-person links really happen. And that, storytelling happens through sport, it happens through cinema, it happens through dance, it happens through literature. My whole family, I guess, my brother was a cricketer, my mum and dad both worked in international education, and I've worked in both countries. So we're all very passionate about India-Australia relations. And so it's been a big part of my life. And I think there are a lot of community members like us that really, all we want to do is bridge that gap and not feel sidelined or othered. And, we're doing the work in the community space. I just think it's about harnessing that talent, that storytelling, and bringing it into the mainstream.
Absolutely. Cool. I also want to touch upon the last year has just been absolute chaos. And it comes with its pros and cons. I think it's been a learning experience in many ways as well. But if one were to focus on the sectors that you work in, or your career and your first-hand experience, what have the last 8 or 9 months been like of lockdown?
I think wow. I'm very lucky in many respects, is that I was working nonstop right before COVID. So for me, I was like, this is a really good break.
Fair enough.
But I say that with utmost sympathy for everyone. And obviously 10 months in, I'm now going, okay, the break's been long enough. Someone wake me up at 5 a.m. and tell me I need to be on a set, because that was my life every other day. But yeah, having shot Tom and Jerry and the one right before COVID happened, I luckily have 2 projects coming out. So I'm very excited to see where that enables me to build further. But it also showed me how resilient artists are and the way that we were all able to pivot. I mean, I shot a show called Retrograde, as I said, which was about, 29-year-olds sitting on a computer having a drink every night. And a sitcom about that, which was hilarious. And I didn't know that was possible to shoot in isolation. We shot remotely. And it was very well received. I've just done a comedy for Audible, an Audible original, with some of the greatest Australian comedians. And I'm like, I would never have been in this situation if COVID didn't happen. So I think it's just everybody is looking to innovate, which is really exciting. I think it's also great because people have taken stock of, because we had Black Lives Matter pick up during this time as well, it really forced everyone sitting at home to stop, think, understand where we're all living. And I think the combination of a global pandemic, which is humbling for every human on the planet, and we're all realizing how susceptible we are to this very same virus. So it's a huge humanizer, coupled with a movement which forces you to really look at kind of the systemic racism upon which the new world is built. I think there was almost a perfect storm there in terms of our own introspection as a race. And that for me was a watershed moment. And particularly as a brown woman working in the arts, I was like, what are the chances that this applies so directly to everything that I have struggled with my whole life? So I'm really excited with the way a lot of cultural institutions started to introspect about the way that their organizations operated, whether they were inclusive at an organizational level, at a curation level, and so many other things, and how they contributed to the us and them worldview and the paradigm of the haves, the have-nots, the ins, the outs. And I think that that's going to be really exciting because a lot of people will be creating new work based on that thinking. And that's really great for the post-COVID generation, I think.
Correct, absolutely. And like you mentioned, productions going remote and people continuing to try and work in some capacity or the other has obviously shown a lot of resilience within the arts and the film sector and so many different ways. From your lens, where do we go from here in terms of collaboration between, say, India, Australia, maybe even other parts, other communities coming together to work together in different ways? Whether it's to tell stories, whether it's to create content, whatever it might be. I think the pandemic has also shown us all these tools that are now available for people to be into absolute corners of the world and still be able to do amazing things together. The fact that you and me are having this conversation right now, two completely different parts of the world, but where do you see this as an opportunity in terms of collaboration and building for the future?
I think you just hit the nail on the head. The fact that you and I are even having this conversation, and it's something that has been brought up within the paradigm of the Australian kind of diplomatic activity, is showing that there is an appetite for this kind of cultural exchange, and there is a need for this kind of cultural exchange, that we are not living in a world of binary kind of identities, that we are all interlinked. And, what you do in Bombay is impacting me over here with whatever music you might produce. Whatever output I create as an artist here reflects upon every other Indian origin person growing up outside of every other NRI, child, because they see possibilities for themselves. So I think it's just about understanding that because we're so interconnected, your impact can be much greater. So if we need to create a more harmonious sense of social cohesion, we need to fund projects which will enable that. We need to encourage stories that bring new perspectives to the world, that, for lack of a better word, we've had a white worldview imposed on us as migrants, as members of this post-colonial existence. Even growing up in India, you've grown up with a colonial hangover, right? Like that's gone, that's there. You know that there is white skin privilege in India, all of these things. So we're all now understanding it. We're all at a stage where I'm not going to be gaslit for saying this out loud and being told I'm disobedient or ungrateful or unpalatable. So this is a great opportunity because we're all putting our egos aside and saying, okay, we need cultural exchange and we need to unify at a kind of more human level. How do we use cultural storytelling to do that? And the possibilities are really endless because we have, especially in Australia, great cultural institutions that have support systems, be it, an arts centre, be it the technical expertise, be it studio space. Australia is a great place to provide the framework for arts creation. All cultural exchange is vibrant, not just the Indian kind of community. But I just feel like there is a lot of scope there to invite community arts into more established institutional spaces. And we've seen that happen through like Ozfest and many other things. But, we can scrape deeper into the barrel, I think, of what's happened. And just listen. We all just need to listen a little bit more.
As much as there has been a ongoing conversation for quite some time now, I think we're barely scratching the surface and there's so much more to do and can be done. And obviously in my work with the High Commission and the Consulate, I've now learned about all these different programs that they're trying to work with to enable these collaborations even further. And obviously in my experience, Australia is a country that has this incredible cultural infrastructure where culture is supported in so many means, even at a community level. And now from an international lens, obviously, things like I was told about the Location Incentive Fund. Like you mentioned, there's all these facilities in Australia ready to be sort of used, and they're absolutely world class. And you have the Indian community, which is, probably most well known for exporting Bollywood to the world and taking these, incredibly magnificent productions as a traveling, circus almost, or a showcase of Indian culture, to either shoot or to capture or to tell those stories in those places. And that conversation's also changed, I think, in Bollywood. Now you have these stories about, two people falling in love in a completely foreign land, not necessarily in India, or an Indian boy going out and meeting an, Indian American girl or an Indian British girl, or vice versa. And do you feel that, the programs that might be in place more from an infrastructure lens, are they at a good place already, or do you think there is something more you feel could be done in a particular sector to enable those opportunities at a larger scale?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Australia has done a pretty good job of engaging with, for example, Bollywood over the last few years. My only concern sometimes is that that's at the peril of focusing on its own Australian Indian community, which has a unique experience and a unique identity, which, and that's an identity which can travel. For example, I'm in this show that's coming out. Just a humble plug for my next project.
Go for it.
I'm in a show called The One, which is a Netflix show coming out of a British production. And I was shooting for 4 months in Bristol and London, and they cast me, and I had a discussion with the makers, and I said, I'd like to have an Australian accent. I'd like my character to be Australian, not British. And they were like, oh, okay, that can happen. And I did this in an American pilot I shot a couple of years ago. I said I wanted to be Australian if it could work for the character, because it's not unreasonable that an Australian Indian girl exists and has gone and worked in New York or worked in London, because look at me, for example. And it's like, how do we put this identity on the map? The Australian Indian identity as something to be reckoned with, and as something which is special and unique and has a beautiful combination of the larrikinism of Australia and, whatever, all the complexities and heartache of being Indian. And for me, that's what I'm passionate about. I'm so passionate about that intersection. So that's where my focus is. And I've loved playing characters for the ABC in Australia. Last year, I played a girl who was a bookie in 1985 in the King's Cross region of Sydney, which is a red light district in 85. So it was some shady stuff. But I was like, how amazing, because Indians did exist in 1985 in Sydney. We were not invisible then either. So it's about creating a consciousness around that, so that everyday Indian Australians walk around the streets of this country feeling confident in their duality and in their dual heritage. For me, that's sort of my focus. And I think, bringing Bollywood to Australia is always a great idea, because Australia has, great locations and a great culture. But I feel like as much as we can integrate the experience and create dual heritage pride, that's the core work that will empower Indian Australians, more so than seeing the exoticized version of what it means to be Indian, which is archetypally comes from Bollywood. You bring, the big stars out here, all of that. It's great. It's a great PR exercise. And I don't deny that should happen. But I also hope that we have some focus on more grassroots integration here, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely it does. I think, Bollywood might be, or film rather, at that scale might be a really good access point to begin with. But at some point, it needs to dive deeper and go into the more nuanced conversations and the more, not in the limelight stories and experiences of being an Indian Australian or any other identity.
Yeah, I want to do a documentary series, for example, on women of my mother's age about their experiences in Australia in the 80s, and what were their stories coming here, because they're so diverse. I know aunties that have come from Fiji. I know aunties that have come from West Africa. I know aunties that have come from London, and ones that come from Coffs Harbour because their grandparents were banana farmers. For example, how many people know that in the late 1800s, a bunch of Sikh people came from Punjab and started farming the bananas of Australia, and the biggest gurdwara in the country exists in a beach town in northern New South Wales? For me, that's a fabulous story. The Gaddiwalas in central Victoria that were present during the gold rush, which was 1850s. They still exist as a community of Gaddiwalas that live in central Victoria. Nobody knows this story. The Afghan Cameleers were often Indian. They call the Afghan Cameleers that came from that region in the 1800s. So there are really beautiful grassroots, very core stories that link our two countries, and I would love to uncover those first. 100%. I always say we need to, the archetypes of Bollywood batsman and buttered chicken is a thing of the past. We need to get a little deeper than that now.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, obviously, with reflecting on the past and all these amazing stories, what does the future look like for you now? You've got a lot of exciting work that you've been up to over the last year or so, and at the same time, the last year has been, this weird curveball that none of us expected. So where do things go from here on for you?
They go into a deep act of surrendering and acceptance. I have no option but to be like a Hinduist philosopher about this whole situation. But no, I said I've got two things coming out, or a few things coming out in the next few months, which I'm very lucky that that's happening, and hoping to Australia is one of the few places that we've tackled COVID quite effectively. So productions are starting to open up again next year. So I'm actually looking forward to sinking really deep, because usually I'm flitting around, flying everywhere to shoot, actually really sinking my teeth into exactly the things that we've been talking about and going, this is such a unique opportunity where I need to be on the ground here because I cannot travel, and creating these stories and being a part of this kind of cultural exchange. But yeah, it's taking some getting used to being back in the country that I left, and learning about what Australia is today, because it's changed a lot. And I'm really excited, nervous but excited. I feel like it's in a way Pallavi 2.0, forced by COVID, maybe for all of us in many respects. We're all pivoting right now and figuring out what really matters. So yeah, looking forward to living. I don't know if I'm looking forward to living close to my parents again. I mean, the food's great, but there are some other challenges.
Thank you so much, Pallavi. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you, and thank you for being on the show.
No, thank you. It's been really nice hearing your very poignant questions, and I apologize. I talk a lot. Thank you for listening and conversing in such a meaningful manner.